Hey everyone, today we're going to be beginning our 11th lecture in our discussions here about religion in the United States. And today we're going to be looking at kind of the more reactions that religion has to have to the increasing modernization of the United States. So in our last lecture, lecture 10, we looked at religious reactions to urbanization in the United States, big, massive cities, and the growing distribution of wealth inequality in the United States and how churches and religious organizations respond to that. And we saw two really systems of thought being uh, one, the social gospel movement with Walter Rauschenbusch that believed that it was the duty and responsibility of the church to respond, to fill in the gap, so to speak, concerning these social inequalities that are social responses and that the federal government and city, state, and local governments were failing to respond to these crises. And so people like Walter Rauschenbusch and what is sometimes referred to as Christian socialism believed that they could take fill in the gap and take up the cross, so to speak, in terms of fulfilling and yes, basically fulfilling the needs of local peoples first, and that the church should be more concerned about feeding an individual, clothing an individual, making an individual's life much better in the real world. Outside of the spiritual world, they felt that many people, like again Walter Rauschenbusch, and Washington Gladden was another of these social reformers with the church, felt that the church had focused way too much on revivals and spirituality and not enough on progressive issues like curing the social ills in America. And then on the other side of the coin, we saw someone like Andrew Carnegie, who was a devout Presbyterian, but also a very wealthy businessman, and he believed instead that it required wealthy businessmen with the acumen, with the brains, you know, uh, to figure out the solution, and that wealth was best left um, the distribution of wealth was best left to the rich people, but the rich people had to have a responsibility. So he created, he wrote his famous essay, and and it was in, I can't remember what the journal was. It was in famous New England journal about the gospel of wealth, and that how God had given individuals like him, rich people like him, this great gift of physical wealth, but for the purpose of to see how he would react to wealth, and that wealth was meant to be given away. And so that this was the duty of the rich man to give his wealth, his money, wealth away responsibly. So we talked about that. We also talked about the Catholic controversies, the American controversies within the Catholic Church, and what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be an immigrant in America? How can a Catholic Church that claims to be universal deal with issues like immigration and different cultures and languages within a universal church here in America? And so there were some bumpy roads. We saw some people resist this, like the German Catholic movement or the Polish Catholic Church or Lithuanian Catholic Church here in America that avidly resisted assimilation. But then you had others like Cardinal Gibbons, Bishop Ireland, and Keene, who resisted their efforts and argued instead that no, it is your duty and responsibility to assimilate, and that the Catholic Church needs to understand that there will be some changes, there will be some necessary differences between an American Catholic and a European Catholic, and those differences should be celebrated and welcomed by the papacy. But however, the papacy was very fearful of these changes because of the social problems that were going on in his own country, in Italy, with the unification of the kingdoms of Italy and subsequently the democratic republic that would ultimately be established in Italy, and the curtailing of the powers of the papacy. And so that fears and anxiety bleeded over to the United States as well. So for this lecture today, we're going to be looking at kind of the more reactions to modernization, but more specifically, intellectual reactions to modernization. So the biggie here is going to be Charles Darwin and Charles Darwin's influences in religion and in American religion as well. So we'll be talking about that, and as well because of urbanization, because of the United States becoming a global power, thus we're going to start seeing the world slowly coming to America. We're going to see globalization coming into America, and we're going to see how initial Americas responded to that globalization. So let's talk about Darwin. And so let's talk about the arrival of Darwin's theory. So I don't think I need to explain too much what is Darwinism, but I think everybody now is quite familiar with it. But ultimately, what Darwin believed and what he saw was that basically what the Bible had claimed for so many years throughout history and throughout European history, as the scientific revolution had begun during the age of the Renaissance with people like Galilei Galilei and Copernicus and Johann Kepler. People continually looking to the stars and finding out that traditional beliefs that were held by and promulgated by the Catholic Church were turning out to be false, and that these claims of authority and these claims of truth that the Bible and subsequently the church claims are turning out to be false. And so Darwin's theory was the final nail, or no, let me not say the nail, but the final crack within the dam between science and the church. And so Darwin was able to theorize somewhat successfully that humans and animals and plants and even the earth itself, instead of being a created being as is, as whole cloth right now, that human history and Earth's history, plants history, animals history consistently show that man and animals and plants and the earth evolved as it progressed, and that creation is a progressive act, not an instant act that the Bible and subsequently the church claims it to be. And so that's basically what Darwinism was about, was showing that no, the world was created through progressive acts and clear, distinctible progressive acts. But of course, it gets kind of overblown. So within the decades following the American Civil War, because Charles Darwin's book Origins of Species comes out in 1859, and subsequently the Civil War starts in, if I remember right, April of 1860. And so some people would say, even earlier with the presidency of Abraham Lincoln winning in March, being sworn in, but typically April is kind of considered the date in the month in 1860. So Charles Darwin's philosophy and his scientific discoveries didn't really reach America until after the Civil War, because quite frankly America was kind of preoccupied with open conflict. And so really you have about 1869 to the early 1870s, we start seeing in American universities professors and scientific departments talking and conversing about Darwinism. So it takes a little while for it to come to America, but really by 1878, it was almost the dominant theory across the world. And in America, really by the 1880s, it became the dominant theory in most major universities. And so it became adopted by everybody. And as I kind of say, again, Darwin had posted that all living species had evolved from earlier forms, and that all species had developed traits which enhance their ability to survive, their chances to survive. That, humanity, the reason that humanity and men and Homo sapiens have survived and evolved beyond the Neanderthals is because of our evolution within the human brain, and that we, because of our brain, has been able to increase our chances of survival. Similarly to, an ape, the reason that they can have opposable thumbs and be able to climb up high and use tools has increased their ways and their means to survival as well. So this kind of basic theory. But soon, Darwinism's theory becomes applied to everything, and more specifically in England and the subsequent effects within American culture, was that soon people like Herbert Spencer began to apply Darwin's theories and ideas of everything that happens in history, everything that happens in and the real world happens progressively, that nothing happens within an instant, that change doesn't happen in an instant, but a change happens progressively. That growth, the child, that is born into this world is not automatically born an adult, knowing the human language, being able to know calculus. No, you have to learn it. You have to progressively evolve. And so Spencer took his theories, Darwin's theories of progressivism and evolutionaryism, and applied it to all aspects of human activity. For Spencer, pretty much sociology, that society progressively changes and society progressively evolves, and Spencer was correct. But then it bleeds into other realms, and so you have within the fields of psychology things like really what Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, they were uh, reacting to, much of their theories were a reaction to and applications of Darwinism and progressivism. But it also gets applied to history, and then subsequently it gets applied to religion, particularly the field of biblical study, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But this becomes a major changing point within academic intellect across the world. That change and again, change and culture doesn't happen within an instant, but yet it progressively happens. And so thus we're continuing to evolve. And so thus society is never perfect. Thus society must, and it's the responsibility of society to evolve with it and evolve with modernization. And so, again, the assumption became that humanity has and will continue to evolve along a traceable and predictable trajectory. So, again, this is why sociology, psychology, historiography, religion, it can use Darwinian evolution and progressivism ideas, because it's this idea that all of human history evolves along a predictable trajectory. That if we know its roots, we know exactly where human society is at this given point, that we can measure it with other human societies, our human actions and behaviors, and thus can be able to predict a near future. So, for example, American society. So let's take, for example, American government, and America is a democratic republic. And so, thus, based off, again, progressivism and evolutionaryism, United States often gets compared to that of the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was an example, probably the best example of a democratic republic, and that it had run for almost 600 years as a democratic republic until all of a sudden there was an instance of tyranny, and that being Julius Caesar. And with the election of Julius Caesar as the proconsul and then proconsul for life, he became a dictator. And so the fears of, for the United States and many of the political histories of the United States often get compared with that of Rome. Because again, we are a democratic republic, they are a democratic republic. Rome was established first as a monarchy, and then the people revolted against that monarchy, and then thus created a new system of government, being that of republicanism. The American people revolted against the monarchy, and thus created a new system, that of a republic. So there's a lot of traceable things along with it. And so, thus, American history can be predictable, that we can see predictable trajectories, that what the United States, within our own culture, what roads we're possibly heading down. Now, it's not always 100% accurate, but it's predictable of what we do. And so, that small evidence can be applied to everything, really, within the social sciences. So they can see how it becomes a problem, because then we're not longer, there's no longer the mysteries of the universe apply to God, but the mysteries of the universes are predictable, and thus takes the mystical elements of religion and the Bible away. And so, however, with this near universal acceptance, very quickly, I might add, at least 20 years, somewhat 30, within the American history, Darwinism becomes accepted, and whereby the 18 the 1880s, you start having the establishment of departments of sciences, departments of evolutionary biology within America, and even some universities are Christian universities. Like, for example, like Wake Forest College, or later Wake Forest University, was one of the first Christian universities to accept Darwinism, and have professors who taught Darwinism within their community, and then subsequent problems later happened because of that, and we'll talk about that later as well. But because of this acceptance of Darwinism, many of the traditions and authoritative claims of the Bible became increasingly difficult to defend, or authoritative claims of religion, we might even say as well. So a primary example is that of the creation story in Genesis, that with Darwinism, and and subsequently later this field of study of geology, that proves that the earth is much older than the Bible claims, that if humans beings evolved from earlier forms, not in an instant as the Bible claims, is the Genesis story correct? And so it leads to problems. Well, did God use evolution, or no, is it the Bible is 100% accurate? And so we have problems where some Christians are wanting to accept, scientific, um, empirical evidence, and others that recognize the problem that Darwinism has, because again, it removes the authority of the Bible, or authority of God, from society and culture. And so, religion, many of the religions, and particularly Protestantism, Catholicism, and somewhat Judaism in America, that they all kind of have similar patterns of responses to Darwinism and to the challenge that science had unleashed upon religion, upon traditions, and the Bible. And they all have different, like I said, Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism all have different understandings and different outlooks, but they all had similar patterns of response. So first we see some patterns of some actively resisting, and we will talk about these. They resisted this new intellectual current, and they rejected any modification to traditional theological formulas, like the virgin birth, like creation of the universe in 6 days, that the earth is only for, 6,000 years old versus several millions, if not billions of years old. And so you have some who just actively resisted, and there's an all-out culture war between conservatism or fundamentalism and progressivism or liberalism. So the best example is the emergence that we see in the late 1890s, but all the way up to really the 1920s, of a new movement within evangelical Christianity, and that of fundamentalism. And we'll talk about that here in a second. Others, number two, others came to believe that the traditional forms of faith were either no longer relevant, or must be disregarded completely and replaced by something else, replaced by some other modernizations of religion, and that are or just no religion at all. And so we'll talk about this with our examples. We'll talk about the formation of a new brand of Judaism here in America that happens, much later in the 1930s and 40s, but because of a result of the arrival of Darwinism and the infighting between fundamental Jews and liberal Jews or Reform Jews, and the infighting that goes on with it that emerges out of this fighting is a new form of Judaism that only exists here in America, and that of reconstructed Judaism. Or we'll also talk about the growing movement that happens later that kind of becomes the most popular trend, but then has later fallen away, but still is around. It's kind of gotten absorbed into atheism, or has gotten absorbed into people who do not identify with a religion, and that is basic humanism, the belief in humanity and the progressive goodness and power of humanity, and the lack of a belief in supernaturalism. And so we'll talk about those examples as well. And then also there were some who occupied an immediate, like an intermediate position between the two extremes, either trying to seek to adjust their own faiths and own communities and own realities with modernism and with what was going on, and trying to find out how can they hold on to elements of their faith at the same time hold on to elements of modernization, and being welcoming. How can both faith and reason coexist with one another? And the primary example of that is the conservative Jewish movement here in America, or the conservative Jewish denomination here in America, or also the emergence of liberal Protestantisms, people that who really typically dominate the Episcopal Church, some extents to the Presbyterian, Methodist or Baptist, but less so within them, but primarily the Episcopal Church here in America. How they have taken on elements of modernism, but by at the same time willing to disregard or revamp some of their traditional beliefs. And so we'll talk about some of those as well. But primarily, we're going to focus on fundamental Christianity, the rise of fundamentalism, the problems that go along with that, the emergence of a new form of Judaism here strictly in America, that of Reconstructivism, and the emergence of humanism. What did that mean, as well as atheism? And we'll try to talk about conservative Judaism and liberal Protestants in the meantime, but they're very self-evident in that they try to keep, again, immediate position, that they either accept some elements of modernization while rejecting some elements of traditional faith, or vice versa. So let's talk about the fundamental response to Darwinism and these new intellectual waves that have made its way across America. So prior to the Civil War, American scholarship in our universities was quite limited, and because pretty much so the uh, dominated by evangelical Protestantism or denominational connections. So again, Ivy League schools like Harvard University, even though we typically now associate it with liberalism, Harvard University was very much a conservative university that was dominated and controlled by the Congregationalist Church in Massachusetts for a very long time. Yale University, the Congregationalist Church in Connecticut. Princeton was a Presbyterian seminary and university, and was dominated by Presbyterian churches and members who controlled the doctrines and the language and who the university would hire. Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, one of the Ivy League schools that's less talked about, was established by Baptists, and it was controlled by the Baptist Church in Rhode Island. And we can talk about some lesser schools too that will eventually become popular. Trinity College in North Carolina, that would later become Duke University. It was a Methodist school. Vanderbilt University in Nashville, a Methodist university. Emory University in Atlanta, is a Methodist university, and these major universities are kind of sub-tier universities outside of the Ivy League schools, but are equivalent on academic scales to Ivy League schools. We can see they're routinely tied to denominationalism. University of Chicago was a Baptist university. Southern Cal University, Methodist University. And so Georgetown University in D.C., a Catholic university. So again, a lot of the American scholarship was quite limited because it was controlled by denominations. And so thus universities like Harvard, Princeton were more aimed at producing ministers than they were producing academics. But as with the growth of modernization, and as many Americans were able to study abroad, study at Oxford, Cambridge, or in Germany or in France, they began bringing back popular European ideas where these colleges and universities were full-fledged research institutions or full-fledged research um, um, controlled entities controlled by the faculty and less controlled by denominationalism. And so many people wanted to bring back these new ideas to the American system. And so you start seeing in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, many of the old established American universities changing their ways and becoming less reliant upon denominationalism and becoming more and more committed to academics, committed to research, and committed to faculty freedoms. And so, one of these popular ideas that the Americans scholars brought back to the United States was this great controversy that would later emerge in the American churches, and that was the idea of higher forms of criticism upon the Bible. And so, criticism typically gets a nasty word, and so I'm not meaning just higher forms of, intellectual snobbish criticism, but instead, what this kind of refers to is the ideas that you can apply literary theory and literary investigation upon the Bible because the Bible is, in fact, a literary book that operates under the principles of literary theory. So, if you understand the genre of a book of the Bible, you can understand whether this passage of the Bible is in fact historically accurate, or if the author is using genre to indicate to you that you shouldn't take this thing you shouldn't take this thing seriously. That the nature of something like genre demonstrates for you that this is not so, that this is not the main focus of the story. Or that you can use things like redaction criticism, how books and particularly older books are kept alive and preserved. And that redaction criticism is a technique that was used throughout a lot of ancient narratives and a lot of ancient mythos, particularly from the Greeks, that you could see if you study the books carefully. You can see there's moments and study the manuscripts carefully. You can see moments where the manuscripts are evolving and that they are changing, and that thus, things like Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey, we know that it had changed and had evolved, that other scribes added elements to the stories because we have the manuscripts. And so we take that same ideology about Homer and the Odyssey and we apply it to the Bible with its thousands upon thousands and upon thousands of manuscripts. We've got over 10,000 manuscripts to the New Testament, over 7,000 manuscripts to the Old Testament, and not a single one of these manuscripts are alike. If you study the manuscripts of the Bible, you see times where scribes are making changes to the Bible, and that some manuscripts are much better than others. Some manuscripts are poor in their translation of the Bible, or their understanding are full of errors. So it led to questions of is the Bible that we currently have and possess, is it the most accurate thing? Is it the most accurate book? And at the time, no. The Bible, the King James Bible that was being used in America was well known for not being very accurate, that it had a lot of problems within the manuscripts that needed to be fixed. So the most common example, if you do have a King James Bible, you can go to Mark's Gospel. At the very end of Mark's Gospel in chapter 16, all manuscripts prior to the 4th century, 4th century CE, so 300, around the 300s, prior to the 300s, all manuscripts that we have of Mark's Gospel end at verse 8 of Mark 16. But yet, if you open up a modern day King James Bible, chapter 16 of Mark does not end at verse 8. It continues. It continues on, and gives you another story about the disciples being able to have the power to control snakes, and having these supernatural powers that's been given unto them. And where church handling snakes get their theology from is from this passage in Mark's Gospel, chapter 16. But yet, all the manuscripts prior to the 4th century do not have these verses. They get added later. So the question was, do we delete these verses? Because they're not in our earliest manuscripts. And so you'll have some Bibles, like the NRSV Bible, deleted those passages and have Mark's Gospel ending where the most earliest manuscripts end. Some do not. Some will give you notes and say, like the NIV Bible will say, okay, this is where our manuscripts stop. Some traditions, have this, and we'll continue to go on with this, but they'll give you a note that these remaining passages of Mark are not found in most early versions of the Bible. Or another primary example, one that most Christians don't really like, is that a famous passage in John chapter 8, where Jesus is dealing with the woman who is accused of adultery, and Jesus gives that famous line where the men of this village come and bring this woman who's accused of adultery and bring her before Jesus and say, Jesus, you need to condemn her. What does the law say about this? Trying to trick Jesus, and Jesus doesn't respond, but Jesus simply bends down and starts writing something in the sand. And the people are so unaware of what's going on. They're just constantly accusing and saying, Jesus, what are you going to do? And Jesus stands up and says, that famous line of, he without sin cast the first stone. And of course, no one was without sin, and no one could cast the first stone. And so eventually, one by one, everybody leaves, and it was just the woman and Jesus left alone. And so, of course, the woman thanks Jesus for saving her life, and Jesus says, "Go and sin no more. You are forgiven." Again, that's a beautiful passage. One of my favorite passages about Jesus in the Bible. However, again, our earliest manuscripts of John's Gospels do not have that passage there at all. That passage, we know, was not a part of the original stories of John, that it was added later. But yet, every Bible translator loves that story. It's a great story about forgiveness. And so that's the problem. And so the Bibles, most Bible translations keep that story within the Bible, yet they know that there's some manuscripts, our earliest manuscripts of John, do not have this in there at all. And we know it's in later editions, something that was added into the Bible, but we keep it because it's a great story and because of church tradition. So you can see this becomes problems because you have some people who are wanting to find what is the true Bible of the early church. What was the Bible that Jesus had? And it goes against a lot of the grains. This is this new form of criticism that was emerging in Europe, where people were investigating the Bible and finding out that the Gospels, for example, weren't written by the individuals, that we have later editions of the Gospels being edited later on, conversed together. We know that Matthew's Gospel was written in Hebrew before it was written in Greek, but we don't have the Hebrew version anymore, but the Hebrew version was completely different from the Greek version that we have in the Bible. So which one is accurate? And we have, this theory gospel of Q that is out there. And so you have all these stories, or for the Old Testament itself, that the Old Testament, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we know from reading the Bible. If you just read the Bible, it tells you that Moses didn't write the book. But tradition says, oh, Moses wrote the first 4 books or first 5 books of the Bible, of the Torah, of the Pentateuch. But then there's key passages like Genesis chapter 12, where it said, it shows you that if Moses is writing it, but the editor or the writer says that, in verse 6 will say, the Canaanites were living in the land at that time, meaning at the time that the writer is writing his book, the Canaanites weren't living in the land. But during the lifetime of Moses, they're living in the land. So why does he say they're not living in the land in Genesis chapter 6? And there's 6 more times of that where he says the Canaanites were living in the land at that time. Or how can Moses, who's the author of this book, write his own death in Deuteronomy chapter 31? How can he write his own death? And then it gets preserved because Moses goes away. So you have, like, again, all of these theories about how how the first Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, were coming together. So you can see all these theories, and it caused a lot of problems and a lot of fear and anxiety. But ultimately, the goal of what these biblical scholars were all trying to do was follow the German method of the Sitzenleben, which is a German word of trying to understand and discover the world behind the text, because these texts were thousands and thousands of years old. And if these texts were written by authors have a specific point, and they're writing in response to specific needs within their world. And that's where the truth of the Bible lies, is if you go and investigate the world of the Bible, you might understand more properly what the message of the Bible is supposed to be about, instead of applying your own life circumstances and the world today into the Bible. That's not the purpose of the Bible. And so you had these biblical methods and these biblical goals, and it created so much controversy that eventually started to tear the church apart in America. And so the controversy came to a head with the events of really several professors, but I'm only going to isolate 2 professors because their stories were so much similar. That really we have the same controversy, that what goes on with Crawford Toy and what goes on with Charles Briggs are still happening today in American seminaries or American colleges as well. But the controversy really came ahead with these 2 professors. So Crawford Howard Toy was hired as a seminary professor by Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Charles Briggs was a seminary professor hired at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Both of them were hired at the same time. Both of them studied at the exact same university, in the University of Berlin, and they were great friends. But they were also fantastic theologians who later get kicked out and get disowned by their own denominations. And so that's why we talk about them. So both men, independent of each other, one in Louisville, Kentucky, one in New York City, both men, in their teachings, in their publications, in their writings, taught a series of things that got them in trouble. One, that the Bible was written by men, that it was not written by God, because we have manuscripts, and that the manuscripts contain so many errors. So if the manuscripts were written by God, if the Bible was written by God, why does the Bible have errors? Even some grammatical errors that are still there. Why does it have errors? If it's written by God, a perfect being. Thus, it has to be written by men. And because if God, the other side of the argument is, if God wrote the Bible, then what's to stop God from writing the Quran, writing, the Upanishads from Hinduism, or the Bhagavad Gita in Hinduism? What's the difference? Whose claim is right and who's not? We don't know. So again, men do writings. They're inspired by God or inspired by God's message, but it's still products of men. And so that's subjected to the realities of men, and that men can be wrong. And thus the Bible does contain errors. Number 2, if it was written by men, the Bible is thus literature and subjected to the rules of literature. And so thus, if you can understand things like genre, that you don't go to Star Wars, read a book on Star Wars and take it as nonfiction, take it as a history of the world. You clearly know it's fiction. You know that, Harry Potter, it's fiction. Twilight, fiction. That these are all fiction stories, that these are not true stories. And you know that because of the genre, that they are not meant to be taken literally, that their messages, their principles, their stories are meant to be taken true. So things like Aesop's Fables or Hansel and Gretel, these morality stories that we tell to our children, that the reason we tell these stories is because of the morals within the story. And so if this is how literature operates, and the Bible was written by men, and men write literature like fiction, nonfiction, history, biographies, propaganda, things like that, the Bible has to be subjected to the rules of literature as well. And so we need to investigate some of these. Number three, which is probably the most controversial, is that the Old Testament prophecies were post-prophetic. And what that means is that, according to most biblical scholars who have been able to study this and see this for truth, most of the biblical prophecies in the Bible were written after the fact. So like the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel was not written in the 5th and 6th century as the book claims, or as church tradition claims, but in fact doing, historical higher forms of criticism upon the Bible and the manuscripts, studying the language of the manuscripts and the words that are being used by the author and the situations in which he describes, we know with, a near certainty that the Bible or the book of Daniel was written during the 2nd century BCE, during the Hasmonean crisis. And he's responding to the Hasmonean crisis and writing prophecies about how everything was being predicted, how God was using the world and using the Persians and using the Greeks to set up this great moment and this great battle in which we need a historical figure, a messianic figure that would emerge like Judas Maccabees and the Maccabeans, who fought the resistance, who just were able to resist the Seleucid kings and thus grant religious freedom to the Jews in the 2nd century, and creating, the Hasmonean kingdom that later would spur Jesus, and then also, the holiday of Hanukkah has its roots back to this. So this was quite problematic, because if the prophecies were post-prophetic, then they're not always talking about the future. And so those passages from Isaiah, if they're post-prophetic, that Isaiah's passages that are used by the Gospels later to talk about Jesus are now to be interpreted as talking about the Jewish community at his time. So that became hugely problematic. Number four, that Moses and Isaiah were not the authors of their books, that they were attributed to them. So again, we have tremendous amount of evidence, historical proof that Moses was not the writer of the Torah. And that Isaiah, that there are several books of Isaiah, several editions of Isaiah out there, and that there's typically identified three separate authors within the book of Isaiah because of the words that they use, the phrases that they use, the responses that they use, the language that they use, everything. You can actually see where the writers are and where their traditions have emerged together. And so that became hugely problematic, because, again, if Moses is not the author of the Torah, and that we know it was later an edited book that was later edited from other types of books, that becomes problematic. And number five, which is probably the most controversial of them all and got both Crawford Toy and Briggs into hot water, was that the Gospels do not fully contain the words of Christ. That they contain, that we know, again, because things like John's Gospel chapter 8, the story of the woman caught in adultery, we do know that that was a made-up story. That was later, because we have it being inserted into the book of John at a much later period. But yet it claims to be the words of Jesus. And so thus, not everything within the Bible is the words of Jesus. Now, there are some words that are of Jesus, because we know of other, phrases or traditions that have been quoted or been used, but not everything is from Christ, that some things have been made up, possibly. And that the Gospels are not, because of genre, they're not to be taken as a true biography. Gospels were written very commonly during the Greco-Roman period, and that the Gospels, as a style of genre, were basically propaganda literature, written in such a way and to tell a certain story in such a way so that you might believe something special about this individual. So we have various other forms of Gospels being written. The most famous one of a Gospel written about the Emperor Augustine, and that he was declared the savior of the world just like Jesus was. And we have this gospel story written about the Emperor Augustus. And so, what's the difference between that and the Gospels of Jesus? Both are historical people, both were actually true people, but again, the nature of the genre tells you you're not to take everything 100% to be true. It's written for a specific purpose so that you might understand that why the Emperor Augustine is such an amazing person, why Jesus is such an amazing individual. So both of these men subsequently got fired because of their controversy. However, they created a great problem within the church because they were both seminary professors who taught for years at Toy taught for 20 years at Southern Seminary. Briggs taught 25 years at Union Theological Seminary, and they're training ministers. And they're open, and so they had ministers who believed the same thing that these two men believed in, and so they're going back to their churches, and their churches are teaching the same doctrine that both Toy and Briggs are teaching, and then subsequently everything comes to a head 30 years down the road, and you have churches fighting over each other because of these men. And so you had the divisions even within seminaries. And so subsequently, after the firing of Charles Briggs, he's a Presbyterian minister teaching at a Presbyterian seminary or, quote, university in New York. Princeton Seminary responds to Charles Briggs, and Princeton breaks away from the Presbyterian Church in response because they were fired. They fired a seminary professor. And the stories about this was pretty bad, and that some of the denominations would pay students to be fake students to go to these seminaries in order to write down and record everything that Crawford Toy said or everything that Charles Briggs said, and they would bring it back to trial. And there was evidences with Briggs that some of the documents and the testimony absolutely were false and made up. But it didn't matter because, again, the fighting was happening within the churches, and there was fearful. And the overwhelming fear during the fundamental response was this idea of the quote-unquote slippery slope. That if we are willing to deny one aspect of the Bible's claim, so for example, that the world was not created in 6 days, what else in the Bible is not true? The resurrection, the virgin birth, the Exodus, Noah's flood, stories that are monumental to Christian faith or to Judaism. So that's what was the fear, that if we're willing, for many fundamentalists, both on the Christian and Jewish side as well, that if we're willing to accept one thing as not being true within the Bible, then the fear is that we have to accept none of it as being true. And so you can't give ground. So thus, it was this argument of the slippery slope. And so that has caused problems, and we still have those problems today in our churches, in our communities, as well as today. Why they still are having the fight between creationism and evolutionism, our intelligent design versus atheism, and all this stuff that we're seeing still playing out is because of this simple argument, the slippery slope argument. Because if one thing is not true, then what else is not true? And so we have this problem. So in continuance, a concerted effort was made later on, starting in the 1910s, against the rise of modernism and the rise of liberalism encroaching upon Christian communities, Christian churches, Christian institutions. And what emerged was a particular voice of resistance, particularly two prominent men, A.C. Dixon and Reuben Torrey. And so both men, in 1909, both men teamed up with a Californian rich man, oil baron named Lyman Stewart, out in L.A., who they teamed together, and Stewart financed both Dixon and Torrey to create a series of theological pamphlets and theological tracts that were designed to supplement, you know, um, seminary training and university training. Because again, the fear was the seminaries are the problem, the universities are the problem, higher education is the problem. So thus, what we're basically doing is we're creating our own institutions, and so thus we're encouraging people not to go to seminary, but just take our pamphlets, these books that we're going to make, and these handouts that we're going to make, and you can teach, you can learn what is the true belief that's not being taught to you about the Bible and about the truth. And they were very much fundamentalist in their ideas. And so these pamphlets were designed for the sole purpose, as Torrey says, quote, a new statement of fundamental beliefs of Christianity that all Christians must believe in order to be Christians. And this was their gain, that if you're going to be one of us, if you're going to be an evangelical Christian, you have to believe in these things and these pamphlets, and they would pass them out. They would send them out to everybody because, again, Lyman Stewart was a rich millionaire. And so these pamphlets were free, and they were being mailed out everywhere, to every single YMCA in America, to a lot of churches throughout the rural South, Midwest, and out west as well. They were ignoring, the Northeast at the time, but they were sending these pamphlets out. They were sending them to churches and to church members, to pastors, or to people who wanted to be ministers who were training at seminaries. They would send these pamphlets out to them as well. And so between 1910 and 1950, they published and mail free of charge over 3 million of these booklets all across America. And the pamphlets became so popular that people actually collected them and would put them in their jacket pockets, or would bring them or read them along with their Bible. And so eventually around 1917, Dixon and Torben had the great idea to let's create a book. Let's put all of our pamphlets that we've been writing for almost 6 years together into a book. And all of these pamphlets they put together made up 12 books, a 12-volume book that was called simply The Fundamentals. And so this became kind of the new theological thinking within evangelicalism. And so this is where the term fundamentalist Christians comes from this book, The Fundamentals, that was published, and was at one time the most popular book in America throughout the 1920s. By 1910, I think by 1920, it had already sold 10 million copies in America. And so everybody had it. I know my grandfather had a copy of the Fundamentals, and that he would read them every single night. He would read it more so than the Bible, and he thought that that was more accurate than the Bible at times. Just shows you how convoluted it eventually got. But why the fundamentals are so important is because what the books did was that it served to coalesce all of conservative Christianity, Protestantism, and then also Catholicism together into a basic creed that they could all rally against, and they could all fight against liberalism and modernism and its influences within the church and within our Christian institutions. And subsequently later, by 1925, both Torrey and Dixon were talking about, in our political institutions as well, that liberalism was attacking our political institutions, and we needed to change this as well. And so you'll see that same basic pattern reappear when we talk about the moral majority movement in the 1980s. And so what the basic creed was of the fundamentalist movement and of the books was basically this, that every Christian that was conservative can agree to this, and they must agree to this in order to be one of us. One was that the belief in the virgin birth. And so Catholics could jump on this. Protestants, Pentecostals, Presbyterians, Mormons could jump on this. Number two, that the miracles of the Bible are absolutely 100% without a doubt true. And you have to believe that. Every single one of them, down from Elijah curing the dead child, to the miracle that Paul and Peter created in Acts as well. Number three, that the crucifixion was real and true, and that you had to believe in substitutionary atonement. And that's just a side note. I'm not going to really talk about that, but that was something that back to Calvinism that we talked about earlier, and that brought it in is that you had to be, it pushed all the evangelicals and conservatives back to Calvinism because Calvinism was really prominent about substitutionary atonement. Number four, you had to believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus, that he had to have risen from the dead, that he had to have died, and that he had been buried for 3 days and rose again, because there was popular beliefs swirling around academics at the time that Jesus actually didn't die, because there's evidences, we have several evidences within Roman stories of people that survived crucifixions, that Romans, that if they if a person survived crucifixion for a certain amount of time, certain amount of days, that the Romans would in turn by law release them and remove them from the cross, and that they would still have, and we actually have reports from Romans talking about that, people who would have marks on their hands and on their legs from the crucifixion, and they survived. And so thus this was one popular theory among a lot of scholars, is that Jesus was one of these people, that he survived the crucifixion, but the story of him dying and burying a dead, because according to the sign of Jonah that's mentioned in Matthew, where Jonah goes in the belly of the whale for 3 days and then gets spit up, that needed to happen again. And so thus the story of him dying and then physically resurrecting was created around Jesus to create this myth. But in fact, what happened was that Jesus actually survived the crucifixion like so many other people and was subsequently released. Again, that's what some people theorize, and so the fundamentalists at the time were responding to that very popular theory. And so again, you can see Catholics jumping on this, Mormons jumping on this, Pentecostals, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, everybody can jump along this. And then the fifth one was that the Bible was the inspired word of God, and that the Bible did not contain any error within it. And so this was very problematic among many scholars, because again, many scholars know that the Bible does contain errors within it. We do know from the manuscripts, and many of our modern Bibles actually have footnotes telling you, yeah, this is an error. The Bible should be reading this, but we're keeping with this reading because of church tradition. And so there is that part. But however, you see this was a very basic creed that you can unite everybody to coalesce around their movement. And so Dixon and Torrey were very successful to create a new movement within America called conservative Christianity, or fundamentalist Christianity, that was able to bring Catholics and Protestants together. Now, they weren't very successful early on in this period, but they would become much later when we talk about the moral majority movement in the 1980s. Due to the prominence, the popularity of the fundamentalist movement, the movement was aided with the popularity and the production of the famous Scofield King James Bible, Scofield King James Reference Bible. Sorry, let me phrase that. That basically the Reference Bible, which was the first of its kind among the Protestant churches, which was a study Bible, as you know it today, that had notes, full of great notes and references written by scholars. And so this was a tool. The Scofield Reference Bible was a tool that was either again, like the little pamphlets, to supplement or replace seminary training for many ministers. But more importantly, for the Scofield Bible, why it became popular, and I actually have a Scofield Bible, and it does do this, is that it has certain sections within the Bible that tells you, now watch for this, if your minister starts preaching this, or your minister starts doing this, he's a liberal. And it'll have those phrases, like if you say, oh, if he denies the authorship of Moses of the Pentateuch, he's a liberal. Or if he ever says the word Deutero-Isaiah or Second Isaiah, he's a liberal. And so it was also written and aimed towards the lay people in order for them to judge and criticize their ministers. And so it became a new trend within the fundamentalistic and conservative churches, that churches tended to hire ministers that would appeal to them. and to appeal to their senses. And you had a lot of ministers that now, and we don't have time to talk about this, but there's famous stories from the 1950s and 60s when another round of persecution happened within the American churches and ministers, called doublespeak. That ministers that we know that wrote stories about, when they got fired or got kicked out of seminary, that they had to learn what they would call doublespeak, that they'd have to learn to teach and preach what people wanted to hear in order to save their jobs and keep their jobs versus the truth. And so they would often call it doublespeak. They would have to learn this skill that they couldn't preach true messages or real stories or real academic sermons, that they had to constantly preach what people wanted to hear in order to save their jobs. And so the Scofield Bible was a prominent part of that, because again, many people would read it and they would study it more so than studying the Bible. They would study the notes and take the notes as gospel truth, but they were written with a particular aim. And underlying the conservative or the fundamentalist movement within evangelical Christianity was a belief in the rise and the reemergence of premillennialism. And so premillennialism, we've already kind of talked about postmillennialism, or just simply millennialism, this belief that emerged within the Second Great Awakening, that out of Arminius theology and Methodism that believed in human perfectionism was possible, that postmillennialism believed that the world would continuously progress and get better. And then that was the goal of the church, and the goal of Christians was to progressively heal societal wounds. And as Jesus says in the famous prayer in Matthew, "Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done." That is the whole goal of postmillennialism, is bringing about the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Premillennialism is the complete opposite. That premillennialism basically believes that the world is never getting better. It is progressively getting worse and worse and worse. It's never getting better, and thus it's got to get worse in order for Christ to return. Instead of the opposite, where postmillennialism, the world has to get progressively better for Christ to return. So thus the church needs to go and invest in social activities and social movements. Premillennialism says, forget all that crap. The world needs to get worse for Christ to return. And so they had this new change in mindset. And then also, what emerged within the fundamentalist movement was this other underpinning premillennialism, and this belief called dispensationalism. And it's the belief that that there's certain periods of history and time that are predictable and that are based from the Bible, and that you can predict when the world is coming to an end. And so we're going to see this when we get to Jehovah's Witness movement, because Jehovah's Witness and really Seventh-day Adventism and everything emerged out of this movement of dispensationalism that existed early on, but it has been remaining founded. So another national part of dispensationalism is this tie to Israel and the fate of Israel. So this is why fundamentalist Christians or evangelical Protestants will continually support the nation of Israel, because of dispensationalism. Israel has to emerge as a nation state again, and the temple has to be rebuilt in order for Christ to come. So that's why you have today in Israel, you have many of the homes that are being constructed in Israel illegally, and the occupied territories of Palestine are being funded primarily by American churches back here and evangelicals, because they believe if we can cause problems in Israel, Christ is going to hasten Christ's return. And so again, premillennialism saw that the main issue why premillennialism is so important is because progressivism is the great enemy of the church now. It is the problem instead of the solution. And so this is where you have the divide happening within the church and between liberals and conservatism. Because again, progressivism becomes the problem, becomes the enemy instead of the solution. And so, I've already kind of talked about dispensationalism here. And so you have the emergence of fundamentalism that becomes the underbidding and the pinnings that will later get to talking about the moral majority movement later on in America. So now let's talk about modernist responses within Judaism. So let's talk about Reconstructive Judaism. So between the years 1880 and 1925, around 2.8 million European Jews had migrated to America, primarily from Russia, from Poland, from Eastern Europe, from Germany as well. So they had migrated to America, but however, studies had shown by the 1920s that really all uh, fast and how powerful and how that most of the American or Jews living in the world today were now living in America. 23% of all Jews living in the world today at that time in 1920 were living in one country, that of America. The other majorities were still in Poland, still in Germany, still in Russia and Czechoslovakia, these countries that would later become problematic for the Jews during World War II. And so in America, out of these, in the 1920s, about 80% of all Jews who lived in America self-identified with Reform Judaism. And so we talked a little bit about Reform Judaism that was very much a modernist view of religion, that Reform Jews believe and accept that their religion and their tradition needs to progressively change and evolve. And so thus many Reformed Jews might not practice kosherism. They might, eat, a bacon cheeseburger. They might eat a bratwurst. They might not go to synagogue on Saturday, but they still identify themselves as Jews. They might even believe in God, but they still will go to synagogue and do the practices and the rituals of Judaism. And so this was very popular. And so, however, a growing problem within Judaism was that many of the Jews were becoming what we know as Americanized. And what I mean by that, it was that they were becoming more, the Judaism was becoming more and more Protestant in its looking. So in their dress, in their appeal, in their clothing, in the styles of worship, the synagogues were beginning to look more like Protestant churches than they did look like synagogues. And then eventually by the 1935s, because of this Americanization and this kind of secularism of Jews, a survey was done in 1935 in New York that found that 75% of all New York Jews, who represent the majority of all Jews in America, attended no Jewish services. So they were, quote unquote, losing their faith here in America because of modernism, because Judaism tended to, those coming to America tended to be more conservative. But when they came to America, they tended to evolve and become more liberal, become more reformed in their way of thinking and ideology. So, a creative response to this situation was conducted by a seminary professor, a Jewish seminary professor at Yeshiva University, and Mordecai Kaplan, who created the Reconstructive movement within Judaism. So, for the most part, Judaism embraced most elements of liberalism here in America, most elements of modernism. And we already talked about the Jewish Enlightenment movement known as Haskalah that came to America with Isaac Mayer White. Again, more modernist takes on Judaism, and still a significant population of Judaism had resisted these elements. And they were mainly the ones who were coming and migrating to America. Orthodox Hasidic Jews that stayed here, that were coming from Poland and from the Ukraine, were coming to America and resisting what they were seeing within Judaism. And so there became a strict divide between Jewish communities. Orthodox fighting Reform Judaism are not even associating with each other. Reform Jews in America tended to abandon many of the significant elements that constituted Jewish identity and culture. Things like kosher, things like dress, things like working on the Sabbath, things that were typically, given only to Jews. And so Kaplan wanted to heal the divide between Jews, conservative Jews and liberal Jews, Reform Jews, Orthodox Jews, wanted to heal the divide and strike a balance between this growing Americanization of Judaism and maintaining, ethnic Judaism. So he wrote, as seminary professors do or university professors do, he wrote a book. So he wrote a famous book called Judaism as a Civilization in 1934. And in that book, Kaplan argued that Judaism is not a religion, but rather a religious civilization based off of how the laws of the Torah work and everything, that it operates more like a civilization and more like a community. Judaism is a place where both religious and non-religious Jews, ethnic Jews, can share a cultural aspect, and that aspect being Judaism. So in his mind, the purpose of the synagogue was not only to be just simply a place of worship and doing religious acts, but the synagogue was supposed to be a receptacle or a promoter of Jewish identity. And this was where he was very successful here in the United States, because that's how synagogues kind of operate now today in America. Synagogues are places of where Jewish identity is promulgated outside of, aspects that we consider religious. That people go to synagogues not just because they want to worship God and worship Yahweh, but instead because they want to celebrate their Jewishness and their Jewish culture. And so the synagogue became a place for everybody and part of his reform movement. He goes on to argue later in his book, as for religion, Kaplan believed that there was little place for superstition. So he said, to modern man, religion can be no longer be a matter of entering into a relationship with a supernatural being. The only kind of religion is that which can help him live and get the most out of life will be the one which will teach him to identify as holy, whether in humanity or in the natural world that enhances him. So this is where he became problematic, because he sided more so with the Reform movement instead of the conservative or the Orthodox Jew that said religion itself needs to evolve. We need to evolve beyond this idea of a supernatural being that we call Yahweh, and look at a more humanistic approach and a more humanistic ideology of Judaism. And so, of course, Kaplan and his movement wasn't always successful, and it was also hard to distinguish it between him and Reform Jews. And so, by the 1940s, Kaplan and his team of people created their own Jewish community, thus Reconstructive Judaism. And there's a few of those synagogues here in America, but they're also very hard to distinguish between them and Reform Jews, because, again, some Reform Jews that I know are very much humanistic and very much don't believe in Yahweh, do not believe in God, do not believe in supernatural beings, but yet they stay Jewish and go to synagogue because it promotes and continues their Jewish identity. So they'll practice Seder, they'll practice Passover, they'll celebrate Hanukkah, they'll do Yom Kippur, they'll celebrate Purim, they'll do all of the festivals of Judaism, but they might not believe in any of it because they recognize that it maintains their identity. And so that's one response. Again, it was what's more important, maintaining your cultural identity and finding those elements within religion that help you become a better human being, instead of worrying about worshiping a divine being who's ready to strike you down with a thunderbolt. That's where Kaplan found. All right, so now let's talk about modernist reactions within Protestantism. So with the emergence of scientific empirical evidence and inductive analysis and data gathering systems and systems of thought, it provided a model now for some Protestants to try to do the work of theology and theological reflections. So there were some Protestants who were quite comfortable with these new paradigms of sciences and tried to apply them to religion and tried to understand religion as quasi-science and tried to find ways to rationally and scientifically discuss what is science. And instead of having some kind of demonstration of religion and faith. So you had some people like William Channing, who scrutinized Protestant theology and concluded that Protestantism needed to evolve, and that it made more sense to believe, instead of a triune God, of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, but to believe in more of a Unitarian ideology about God, that there is only one God, and that he's not so much a supernatural being that we refer to as a he, but rather that he's a ultimate reality, a reality that exists beyond the world that we can't truly comprehend, but yet we use words like love, God is love, God is kindness, God is compassionate to try to understand who God is instead. Then you had other people like the famed theologian Horace Bushnell during the Civil War and afterwards, who saw a middle ground by rejecting some outdated beliefs about Christianity, about the Bible, and advocating for that Christianity needs to evolve and to be more sensible and rational. So Horace Bushnell would say, for example, that Christianity can't, so for example, it's not necessary to believe in the virgin birth because that's not the point. The point is that, God has given us forgiveness through the sacrifice of Jesus. Or he might go on to say that it's not important for Christians to have a harsh attitude towards alcoholism. That really what we should be, about, not just having one drink, but rather we should be worried about those who have several drinks. And that's what we should be more focused on. So small things like that about things that we need to reject, outdated beliefs, that it's important for you to be baptized. Horace Bushnell would say, is that really important? It seems to be an extraordinary thing, or we have to celebrate the Eucharist every time, and if we didn't partake in the Eucharist, we're not truly saved. Horace Bushnell would say that's not really important either. It's simple faith that's more important. So again, you had elements, and this is the birth of kind of liberal Protestantism at this time, was that, well, we can accept some elements, like it's not important to believe in the creation, 6-day creation of the world. Rather, we know that God created the world. Whether he used, evolutionism, if he used Darwinism, if he used the Big Bang, if he used aliens, we don't know. It doesn't matter. The ultimate point is God created the world. We don't care about the details, but rather the detail is that we have a God who cares about us. And so this is kind of the focus that he wanted to have. And so we have kind of the birth of liberalism within the Protestant community. But at the same time, unbelief was a rarity in America, really all the way up until the 1880s. That it was, less than 1% of Americans self-identified with not believing in a faith or believing in atheism or in agnosticism. But as 1880s progressed and as Darwinism and scientific revolutions emerged, more and more Americans began to self-identify with atheism, or more importantly, with agnosticism. So if you don't know what agnosticism is, Gnosticism is a Greek word meaning knowledge. A is a negative in the Greek language, so against, you're not for gain. So agnostics, you're against knowledge, you're not for knowledge. And so agnosticism began to come out with a significant piece of real estate and turf. And so you had people like Robert Ingersoll who would go out and preach in popularity and popularize believing in atheism, that being an atheist was okay, and that the things like the First Amendment guaranteed the right for atheists to exist in America and in the world, and that his popularity was very popular. In fact, he actually had a city in Texas named after him because of how popular he was. And he tried to create an influential space for non-believers in America, saying that Americans shouldn't have to be identified with a religion in order to be an American or be a prominent American within our society. And instead, he said that America should, in order to keep advancing, to keep being number one, to beat everybody else, that we needed to commit ourselves to science and reason over religious superstition and revelation. That we need to make governmental efforts and societal efforts now in order to stay ahead of the game and stay ahead of the curve. And so he was very popular. And so he had famous key sayings like, religion is an artifact of ignorance, and of a fearful past, that science is the modern way that promises the release from the prison house of superstition. But then you had some others who took two different approaches, that instead of just denying religion and then subsequently Ingersoll started to attack religion outright, you had people that strived within the Protestant church for a middle ground. And so they had a new intellectual thought system that emerged, an approach to religion that became known as pragmatism. And we've already talked about this with William James. And so William James and one of his cohorts there at Harvard University, Charles Peirce, that both argue that religion has a value. Religion has a social value, and that social value is really what's important. That it has value to the individual. So it doesn't matter what he believes in. And if he believes in a flying spaghetti monster as God, or if he believes in the virgin birth, or he believes in no virgin birth. What matters is what religion, the results of religion. And that's what we should tolerate within society and American society. So if religion produces a certain results, and that result being it makes an individual better or healthier, or makes him more smarter, or makes him a better husband or better wife, that's more important, and that should be celebrated and tolerated in American society. So this is where James and Peirce said that they recognize that religion does have quote unquote cash value. It's measurable, it's real, but it's real to the individual. It might not be real to me, and I might look at you and understand like, why in the heck do you believe that aliens existed? And I might come across someone who believes in Scientology, and I'm like, dude, how can you believe in that? For William James and Peirce, it says that doesn't matter. The philosophy, the rationalization, the reasoning, that doesn't matter. What matters is the results. And so if that person, because of his religious beliefs and practices, is a better human being, that's all that matters. And so you had people that created movements. And so they took aspects of Scottish realism, you know, that what matters is an emotional response. And they took that and said that those are real aspects of religion. That's where aspects of religion really truly lie, in the individual experience. And so later they tried to make it more scientific and said that's the only way religion can be scientifically measured and proven as a real thing, is showing the experiences and how the experiences change someone. Eventually, you had a later cohort of William James, John Dewey, who is also known as the father of American pragmatism. He argued that religious institutions actually do have a pragmatic value in teaching morality and providing a sense of community. But outside of that, there's nothing. Nothing on an educational level, nothing on a scientific level. That the only thing that religion's true purpose is as you say here, teaching morality, providing a sense of community, but nothing else. Nothing else at all. So he's willing to regulate religion more so. And so he goes on to say that the goal of religion and science is human happiness and self-fulfillment. So therefore, the ultimate aim of both was to aid humanity in their discovery of the fullness of the potentiality within humans. And so what John Dewey subsequently did was he ended up creating a new system of religious thought, because he was ultimately rejected by his beliefs and ended up creating and developing what became known as humanism today. And so for humanism, it again is that ultimate fulfillment, whatever makes you happy, whatever makes you a better person, whatever helps you discover your true purpose, your true fulfillment, helps evolve you into better. So if that's doing yoga, if that's doing Buddhist meditations and mantras, if that's doing tantric dances and chakras, if that's going to church and praying the rosary, whatever, that's fine. But ultimately, you need to understand that the goal of religion is not this supernatural being. The goal of religion, like science, is to make society and make the individual a better person. And this is how they argued with it and tried to rationalize modernism with traditional beliefs. So the last thing that I want to talk about is the arrival of new alternatives from the East. And so, one of the unintentional byproducts of global missionary activity or industrialization here in America, or immigration as well, was the birth of a new field within the field of academics, and particularly the field of religious studies, and that being comparative religious studies. And so we've already kind of talked about this with our first lecture, but it has influences here. So at the center of the study was somebody named Max Mueller, and we talked about that. Max Mueller was actually a linguist who later became a comparative religious scholar. And he believed that religion, like language, that there is a singular source that requires scientific investigation, and that is the goal of a religious scholar, is to compare all the other religions to find where the ultimate source of religion comes from, but to recognize at the same time that all of us come from the same source. So Hinduism, Christians, Buddhism, we all have the basic same religion. It just has evolved and has been developed quite similar or quite differently because of cultural contexts. So ultimately, because of this idea, and it started to grow here in America, America became the host of the first world's first World's Fair. Really, the World Columbian Exposition was the pre-runner to the World's Fair. And part of the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893 was the Parliament of World Religions, where every world religion would be represented. Every religion would have moments to talk and discuss from the top scholars, and scholars from across other religions could talk and dialogue and discuss with each other, create studies, but also to demonstrate that they are, again, so much alike, so much together. And so it featured many prominent religious scholars from all over the world, and they all came to America. So you had somebody like Swami Vivekananda from Hinduism, Vindika Gandhi of Jainism, a form of Hindu faith that's kind of mixed with Buddhism, but it's more an ascetic style of lifestyle. And then you had Dharmapala from Buddhism, and you had all these other speakers from Catholicism, from Christianity. You had a Muslim as well. They're all there, and they all demonstrated, and they are all speaking constantly to how similar all of their religions were, of what they taught, their ultimate goals, and basically what the ultimate goal of this exposition was to show you that all religions are consumed with the idea of how to get man to transcend his earthly existence, transcend his earthly body, transcend his current situation. So how does Christianity get an individual to transcend? He believes in Christ and ultimately, dies and goes to heaven. How a Buddhist transcends is that he understands the reality of this world and meditates upon it and ultimately achieves nirvana and then transcends from this world to the world beyond. That all religions are getting to that all of them have that basic point to them. They're all trying to return to our source and some idea or notion. But still, part of those line was that the overall solution was that from the conference, and if you went to or if you read the conference and heard, I've got an audio recording of Swami Venkata, and he talked in his discussion. If you listen to him, a lot of people from the East are criticizing the Western religions, because they said, you Western religions, you still need to evolve. You need to progress. You need to progress along similar lines that we have already done in the East, like Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism. We've already gone through some of these situations, these problems that you're dealing with. And we don't have an issue. Most of the Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain religions didn't have an issue with modernity. Most of them were willing to accept modernity, but then later on there was reactions against modernity because it was, colonialism that they were reacting to still against today. But they quickly embraced modernity because there was no issues between science and religion, that they understood the proper relationship that religion had within society. And they're saying, you Western religions, you're still hung up on this stuff. You need to evolve and you need to progress. And so some people took aim at this. And so you had somebody like Vivekananda, who remained in America for 2 years and establishing in various cities what he known as Vedanta societies. And so these were Hindu societies that were organized around Hindu principles. But ultimately, the movement for the Vedanta society never took off, but it did create a space that another community group took off. And so that was really the Theosophical Society, took off in that space. And so it was formed originally in 1875 by a woman, Helena Potrikov-Belaski, and a retired American colonel. Um, yeah, I think he was a colonel. He might have been a U.S. captain. But anyhow, Henry Steele Cott. And both of them believed that all religions were really one, and there was a fundamental truth that lied behind all religions. McCloskey claimed that all of the great religious teachers like Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, Hare Krishna, Lao Tzu from Taoism, Confucius, that they were all part of the same, what you call, group of gifted masters. They all had a basic religion and basic message that must be studied and put together. So she started to blend elements of Buddhism, and but then later, when she passed away, Alcott actually started blending in more elements of Hinduism with Western philosophies and Western religions, and so the society tried to blend together elements of Hinduism with Christianity, Judaism with Buddhism, Islam with Jainism, blended them all together to create one new religion. And so they're not very popular here in America, but they were popular among a lot of the social elites here in America during the 1880s and 1890s. But they were more successful, back in India actually, and the Theosophical Society here in America actually helped to revitalize Buddhism in India. As well, because of rich Americans going overseas and trying to help reestablish the Buddhist community that had left in India, that is slowly growing back. But still, the Theosophical Society was born here in America, and for a short while it did exist, but then it kind of has faded away. But remnants still exist because we have still some Americans who practice yoga as an exercising. Some American Christians who practice yoga. Um, but that yoga is actually a religious ceremony, a religious practice within Hinduism and Buddhism, or Hinduism and Jainism. It is a religious practice, but it was birthed out of the Theosophical Society, who used it and brought it together and blending elements of Christianity and Buddhism together. But then it now becomes a exercise crave that we do here in America. So there's residual effects of what the Theosophical Society did here in America. And so the last group that I want to talk about before we close today we're going to revisit some of the new religious movements because of this Eastern philosophy that comes about. And so America started thinking about healing very early in the 19th century, and it was characterized by a focus on two related topics: suffering and therapy. So traditionally in the West, particularly in Catholicism, suffering was always seen as a religious tool for understanding God, and suffering had come from God. So the basic story that we get this kind of belief from is from the story of Job from the Bible. That Job's sufferings were all from God, that Job's sufferings all had a unique purpose and a unique reason to test Job and to show that Job would remain faithful to God in all of his trials. The story in Genesis chapter 22 of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, God telling Abraham to sacrifice his one and only son, that whom he has waited for 80 years, to go to this mountain and sacrifice him. And we interpret it as a test, that suffering and pain all comes for a specific purpose and reason from God. So that we are to see suffering quite positively as coming from God, as a lesson. And we still do this today, that every pain has a purpose. Every tragedy has a purpose, a message that we need to learn from. However, with the arrival of Eastern thought into America, suffering began to be seen quite differently, as being negative, as it is seen in the East, as a negative aspect, as preventing oneself from living in true harmony with the universe and within themselves. So suffering, instead of being seen positively, like it is seen within Christianity, because of the East, suffering is always assumed as an affliction that must be rid of, and that you have the power to get rid of it yourself. And so prior to the Civil War, we have people like Phineas Quigley who were intrigued by the powers of therapeutic powers of mesmerism. And so there's this belief that disease could actually be cured by cultivating healthy attitudes and by the mind, that you can cure yourself. Again, afflictions are seen as sufferings, but you have the power to free yourself of this affliction. That's the whole purpose of Buddhism. Buddhism teaches that life is suffering, that all of life is an affliction, and that the goal of this human life is to learn how to escape that affliction, to escape the endless cycle of samsara, and thus to achieve liberation with moksha. Hinduism is very much the same thing. Jainism is very much the same concepts, but how they go about escaping, how they go about achieving moksha is very different in all those three faiths. So again, but the power always lies within you, within those faiths and those faith traditions. And so that ideology comes to America. And so Quibbs Finley believes this, and that sickness, why we are sick, is because we have wrong beliefs. And so one of Quigley's patients and one of his later followers of his kind of teaching became Mary Barker Eddy. And why is Mary Barker Eddy famous is because after Quigley's death, and Mary Barker claims that she was able to be healed from many of her afflictions because of Quigley's teachings. After Quigley's death, she soon embarked on herself upon an independent health healing career of herself. She believed that the only thing that was real was the spiritual, and that the physical was an illusion, similarly to what Buddhism and Hinduism believes as well, that this world is ultimately an illusion. In Hinduism, they call it Maya, that we suffer from the sin of Maya, suffer the sin of this world as an illusion, that we need to realize that the real and true world is the spirit world beyond. And that is our goal, is to get to that spirit world. So similarly, she believed that this world was fake, that it was an illusion that keeps us tied and keeps us away from the truth, and that the only real world is the spiritual world. But however, with right thinking, with right practices, individuals could recognize that they too were a part of the spiritual world. And so hence physical illnesses, even death, could ultimately be overcome, because death is not real. Anything that is physical is not real, but it's the results of misdirected thinking. So the reason why we die, the reason why we become sick, according to Mary Barker Eddy, is that because of we have wrong ways of thinking, misdirection of thinking. But however, through the help of God, and how she terms God as the internal mind, similar to in Buddhism and Hinduism, they don't always refer to God as this kind of being, but as an ultimate reality. So like in Hinduism, and the philosophical side of Hinduism, the ultimate reality is Brahma, this indescribable thing and reality that exists of Brahma. And that through the help of God, the internal mind, we can harness our own mental energies. And so Mary Barker, and outside of Boston area, she has a small following in 1875, and she creates a religious community in Lynn, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, where she publishes some key authoritative texts for her religious community, science and health with key to the scripture. But the movement really didn't prosper until it actually moved into Boston, Greater Boston itself, and she established there at Boston at the Mother Church later on, the Massachusetts Metaphysical College to train practitioners. And ultimately, after Eddie's death in 1910, her movement was very popular, but the movement became reincorporated as the Church of Christ Scientist, or sometimes referred to as Christian Scientist movement. And so the Christian Scientist movement, at the moment of her death in 1910, had a membership of over 100,000 followers in the New England area. And subsequently, I think around 2.5 million here in America now today. So the movement has grown, but this was the beginnings of the Christian Scientist movement. And so it had its beginnings and a lot of its urgencies from beginnings of Eastern thought and trying to blend them with Christian movement and Christian teachings. And so very much the Christian Scientist movement believe a lot of what's in the Bible, but they apply Eastern philosophy to elements of Christianity. And so we have these new religious movements responding to modernity, responding to globalization, responding to the changes that are happening in America. And subsequently will come to a head once again when we see reactions to these things with the emergence of the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan.